The Galactic Council chamber was, by every objective measure, the most important room in the known universe. It said so right on the brochure. 17 civilizations, each one older than human writing, each one absolutely convinced of its own magnificence, gathered here every cycle to discuss trade, borders, peace treaties, and apparently, today, how funny it was that humans existed. The chamber itself was enormous. Crystalline walls that hummed with ambient energy. Seats carved from materials that Earth geologists would have cried over. Lighting that shifted colors depending on which species needed what spectrum to see properly. It was, in every sense, impressive. Earth had one seat at the far end of the table. Of course it did. Commander Dario Vasquez sat in that seat with the posture of a man who had been told his whole life that he did not belong in rooms like this, and had spent that whole life walking into rooms like this anyway. He was not the tallest delegate. He was not representing the oldest civilization. He was, by the Council's own internal ranking system, representing the 43rd most significant species in the galaxy. 43rd, out of 44, the Vreth ambassador, a creature that resembled what you would get if a praying mantis decided to wear a senator's robe and develop opinions, rose from its seat with the slow theatrical confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Its name was Kezel. It had 17 honorary titles. It was about to earn a reputation it had not planned for. "We have before us," Kezel announced, its translation collar converting its clicking mandibles into perfectly crisp galactic standard, a matter regarding Earth's request for expanded trade lanes and a seat on the Security Directorate. It paused. It looked at Dario. It let the pause do the work. "I will be brief." "No." Polite laughter rippled through the chamber. Kezel was not finished. "The humans have been spacefaring for, 60 of their years. They have one station beyond their moon. They have ships that our youngest academy students would be embarrassed to fly. They have submitted 17 applications to this council and been denied 17 times, and yet here they are again." Another pause. A slow tilt of that angular head toward Dario. "You are, Commander, without question, the galaxy's most forgettable species. We remember you only because you keep showing up." The chamber did not just laugh this time. It roared. Species who had not agreed on anything in 300 years agreed on this. It was, by all accounts, a very good joke. The Brellan delegates made their whistling sound that meant amusement. The Korathi delegation's bioluminescent patches flickered gold, which anyone who knew Korathi biology understood meant genuine delight. Even the usually stone-faced Mejorak observers allowed themselves a slow, dignified nod of appreciation. Dario Vasquez sat through all of it. He did not frown. He did not clench his jaw. He did not do any of the things a man was supposed to do when an insect in a robe called his entire species forgettable in front of 17 civilizations. He smiled. It was a small smile. Quiet. The kind of smile that does not ask for attention but gets it anyway. It sat on his face like a secret that had already decided it did not need to be told yet. Kezel noticed it. The smile was not in the script. Kezel had expected anger, or embarrassment, or the tight diplomatic nothing face that lesser delegates wore when they were outmatched. The smile was none of those things. For just a moment, one brief and quickly dismissed moment, Kezel felt something it could not quite name. It sat back down and told itself the feeling was nothing. It was not nothing. It was the universe's way of giving a very small, very polite warning that absolutely nobody in that chamber was wise enough to hear. Here is the thing about humans that the Galactic Council, in all its ancient wisdom, with all its centuries of accumulated knowledge, with all its crystalline walls and color-shifting lighting and seats made of materials that Earth geologists would cry over, had completely and spectacularly failed to understand. Humans did not come from a nice place. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Every other spacefaring civilization in that chamber had an origin story that involved, at some point, a period of relative comfort. The Vreth evolved on a temperate world with mild seasons and abundant vegetation. Their greatest ancestral threat was a small rodent-like creature that stole their food. They eventually domesticated it. They have a holiday about it now. It is considered very charming. The Brelan homeworld had no apex predators for the last 4 million years. None. Their philosophers wrote extensively about the nature of danger as a theoretical concept because they had never personally met it. The Korathi, bless them, evolved near thermal vents in a warm shallow sea where the worst thing that could happen was occasionally bumping into each other. And then there was Earth, where something was always trying to kill you, earthquakes. Volcanoes. Floods that did not ask permission. Winters that were not symbolic. Summers that were not poetic. Diseases that did not care how important you thought you were. Predators with teeth, predators with venom, predators with neither and just a very bad attitude. An entire continent, which humans later named Australia, that seemed to operate as a personal challenge from the planet itself, as if the Earth looked at every living thing it had created and said, "Let us see how serious you really are," and humans, being humans, stayed, not just stayed. Thrived. Spread. Multiplied aggressively across every terrain that should have killed them, in every climate that had no business sustaining them, eating things they absolutely should not have put in their mouths, and emerging from every single catastrophe with the same fundamental response throughout all of recorded and unrecorded history. Fine. What is next? 200,000 years of losing. Of plagues that took half a population and left the other half to bury the dead and plant next year's crops anyway. Of wars so catastrophic that entire languages were erased, and the survivors invented new ones and started over. Of famines and floods and collapses of civilizations that had thought themselves permanent, each time followed by the same stubborn, unreasonable, almost offensive refusal to simply stop. There was a period in human history, roughly 400 years before they reached space, where they managed to have 2 global wars within 30 years of each other. 2. Back to back. The second one being significantly worse than the first, which was already considered unsurvivable by the standards of the time. Other species, upon learning this fact, assumed it was a tragedy. Humans mostly used it as a reference point. As in, well, it is not as bad as that time we had 2 world wars. The Galactic Council looked at humanity and saw the 43rd most significant species. Slow to space. Limited in territory. Modest in technology. Forgettable, as Kezel had so confidently announced to 17 civilizations in a very quiet room. What the Council saw was a species that had not yet arrived. What they missed was a species that had already survived everything. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. Dario Vasquez understood the difference. Most humans did. It was not something they taught formally. It was something that lived in the bone, passed down through 200,000 years of people who had absolutely no business still being here, and were. Kezel should have asked why Dario was smiling that it did not. 3 months after the council session, Earth went quiet, not gradually quiet. Not diplomatically quiet, the kind of quiet where you stop returning calls but still show up to events and pretend everything is fine. Earth went completely, totally, almost aggressively quiet. Transmissions stopped. Diplomatic channels went unanswered. Trade requests were ignored. The one human attaché stationed at the Galactic Council hub packed his personal belongings into 2 bags, nodded politely at the front desk staff, and boarded the last Earth vessel to leave the station. Nobody at the Council gave it much thought for the first 2 weeks. By the 3rd week, the Vreth Intelligence Office filed a routine inquiry. By the 6th week, Kezel was telling the story at dinner parties. They simply gave up, it would say, mandibles clicking with the Vreth equivalent of delighted laughter, while guests made their respective species sounds of amusement around tables set with food that cost more than most planets' annual budgets. One speech. That is all it took. One honest assessment of their insignificance and the humans folded completely. I almost feel responsible. Then it would pause for effect. Almost. The dinner parties loved this. Nobody sent a ship to check. This was, in hindsight, a decision that would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for the next several hundred years under the chapter heading, What Not to Do When Your Enemy Goes Silent, because here is what was actually happening on Earth during those 3 months. In a facility built inside a mountain in central Nigeria, in a room that officially did not exist according to 7 different governments who had all agreed to pretend very hard, Lead engineer Mara Okonkwo had not slept properly in 11 weeks and was, by all observable metrics, the happiest she had ever been in her entire professional life. Mara was 39 years old. She had 3 doctorates, 2 of which were in fields that most universities did not yet offer because the fields had not fully existed until she started working in them. She had been recruited personally by the Earth Defense Directorate after writing a theoretical paper on compressed mass acceleration that her doctoral committee had described, in their formal review, as, and this is a direct quote, either the most important thing we have read this decade or complete nonsense, and we cannot tell which. It was not complete nonsense. Run it again, Mara said, standing in front of a display wall covered in numbers that her own team members occasionally needed a moment to process. Mara, said her deputy, a compact and perpetually exhausted man named Theo Bassi, we have run it 14 times. Run it 15. Theo ran it 15 times, the numbers came back the same. Mara looked at those numbers for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee, which was cold because it had been sitting untouched for 2 hours, drank it anyway without appearing to notice, and said very calmly, tell fabrication we are going to need more. More what? Theo asked. Mara gestured at the screen in a way that somehow communicated everything. Theo looked at the screen. Theo looked back at Mara. Theo sat down slowly in his chair with the expression of a man whose understanding of what was physically possible had just been quietly escorted out of the building. They are going to lose their minds, he said. They are going to lose more than that, Mara said, and smiled in a way that, had anyone in that Galactic Council chamber been present to observe it, would have reminded them very uncomfortably of a certain expression on a certain commander's face 3 months ago. The facility ran 3 shifts. Nobody complained about the hours, nobody went home. The Galactic Council chamber was, by every objective measure, the most important room in the known universe. It said so right on the brochure. 17 civilizations, each one older than human writing, each one absolutely convinced of its own magnificence, gathered here every cycle to discuss trade, borders, peace treaties, and apparently, today, how funny it was that humans existed. The chamber itself was enormous. Crystalline walls that hummed with ambient energy. Seats carved from materials that Earth geologists would have cried over. Lighting that shifted colors depending on which species needed what spectrum to see properly. It was, in every sense, impressive. Earth had 1 seat at the far end of the table. Of course it did. Commander Dario Vasquez sat in that seat with the posture of a man who had been told his whole life that he did not belong in rooms like this, and had spent that whole life walking into rooms like this anyway. He was not the tallest delegate. He was not representing the oldest civilization. He was, by the Council's own internal ranking system, representing the 43rd most significant species in the galaxy. 43rd, out of 44, the Vreth ambassador, a creature that resembled what you would get if a praying mantis decided to wear a senator's robe and develop opinions, rose from its seat with the slow theatrical confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Its name was Kezel. It had 17 honorary titles. It was about to earn a reputation it had not planned for. We have before us, Kezel announced, its translation collar converting its clicking mandibles into perfectly crisp galactic standard, a matter regarding Earth's request for expanded trade lanes and a seat on the Security Directorate. It paused. It looked at Dario. It let the pause do the work. I will be brief. No. Polite laughter rippled through the chamber. Kezel was not finished. The humans have been spacefaring for, 60 of their years. They have 1 station beyond their moon. They have ships that our youngest academy students would be embarrassed to fly. They have submitted 17 applications to this council and been denied 17 times, and yet here they are again. Another pause. A slow tilt of that angular head toward Dario. You are, Commander, without question, the galaxy's most forgettable species. We remember you only because you keep showing up. The chamber did not just laugh this time. It roared. Species who had not agreed on anything in 300 years agreed on this. It was, by all accounts, a very good joke. The Brellan delegates made their whistling sound that meant amusement. The Korathi delegation's bioluminescent patches flickered gold, which anyone who knew Korathi biology understood meant genuine delight. Even the usually stone-faced Mejorak observers allowed themselves a slow, dignified nod of appreciation. Dario Vasquez sat through all of it. He did not frown. He did not clench his jaw. He did not do any of the things a man was supposed to do when an insect in a robe called his entire species forgettable in front of 17 civilizations. He smiled. It was a small smile. Quiet. The kind of smile that does not ask for attention but gets it anyway. It sat on his face like a secret that had already decided it did not need to be told yet. Kezel noticed it. The smile was not in the script. Kezel had expected anger, or embarrassment, or the tight diplomatic nothing face that lesser delegates wore when they were outmatched. The smile was none of those things. For just a moment, one brief and quickly dismissed moment, Kezel felt something it could not quite name. It sat back down and told itself the feeling was nothing. It was not nothing. It was the universe's way of giving a very small, very polite warning that absolutely nobody in that chamber was wise enough to hear. Here is part 4 fully written out. It was a Vreth junior intelligence officer named Pasek who first suggested sending a scout to the Sol system. Pasek was 22 years into a career defined almost entirely by caution, paperwork, and a complete absence of anything interesting happening, and had developed the kind of professional instinct that comes from decades of watching small anomalies become large problems. Earth's silence was a small anomaly. Pasek filed the request. The request was approved without much discussion. One scout ship, standard reconnaissance, should be back within the week. It was not back within the week. Pasek filed another request. 2 ships this time. The request was approved with slightly more discussion. Both ships departed. Neither returned. No distress signal. No debris detected. No final transmission. They were there and then they were not, which is a category of disappearance that intelligence offices find deeply unpleasant to put in official reports because there is no clean box to tick for it. Pasek, to their considerable credit, immediately requested 10 ships. They were given 3. The 3 ships crossed into the outer Sol system, confirmed their position, transmitted a routine status update, and then produced the exact same silence as every ship before them. Pasek went directly to Kezel's office without an appointment, which in Vreth culture was roughly equivalent to walking onto a stage during a performance and taking the lead actor's costume, and said, with the particular calm of someone who has already decided they are going to be right about this regardless of how it is received, "We need to contact the full council." Kezel looked up from its desk. "About humans," Pasek added. Kezel was quiet for a moment, then it authorized the emergency council session. The full Galactic Council assembled within 48 hours. 17 civilizations. Every seat filled. The kind of attendance that only happened during events of genuine galactic significance, which the Council had not seen in 30 years and had privately begun to suspect it might never see again. The chamber was tense in a way that its crystalline walls and mood lighting had not been designed to accommodate. Species who communicated through color were flickering uncertainly. Species who communicated through sound were making very quiet versions of their usual sounds. The Mejorak observers, who had maintained dignified stillness through 3 decades of routine sessions, were leaning forward. Nobody was making jokes about humanity. The channel request came from Earth exactly on the hour. Dario Vasquez appeared on the central display. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 months ago. Same posture. Same expression. Same quality of absolute unhurried calm that had no business existing on the face of a representative from the galaxy's 43rd most significant species. He was wearing a different uniform. It had more on it than before. Nobody could quite identify what the additional marking signified, and somehow that made it worse. "Council," Dario said. "Thank you for making the time." Behind him, through the viewport of whatever vessel he was transmitting from, the Council could see space that was not empty. It took several seconds for the scale to resolve properly on the displays. The ships were not close to the camera. They were far away, which meant the reason they filled the viewport was not proximity. It was quantity. 4,000 ships. Arranged in a formation so precise it looked computed, because it was. Vessels of a design nobody in that chamber had seen before, carrying geometries that the Vretha's own engineers would later describe in their formal assessment as, and again this is a direct quote, unnecessarily confident. They were not decorated. They were not ceremonial. They had the specific aesthetic of things built entirely to function, which is its own kind of terrifying, built in 90 days, that was the part that broke people. The Karathi's leading physicist, a being who had spent 400 years studying propulsion theory, pulled up the numbers in real time during the transmission and got as far as the third calculation before stopping completely and sitting very still for the remainder of the session. A brilliant engineer in the observation gallery did the math on material fabrication rates, looked at her results, looked at the viewport, looked at her results again, and then very quietly closed her data pad as if she had decided she did not need that information today. The Mejorak lead observer leaned back from its forward position for the first time. 4,000 ships. 90 days, the math did not work. Every scientist in that chamber knew the math did not work. The resources alone should have taken years. The engineering coordination should have been impossible. The fabrication infrastructure required did not exist 3 months ago, which meant humanity had built the infrastructure and then built the fleet, inside the same 90 days, inside the same silence, while Kezel was telling dinner party stories. The math did not work, and yet there it was, through the viewport. Patient. Quiet. 4,000 ships that had no business existing, built by a species that had no business still existing either, arranged behind a man who was still, infuriatingly, calmly, inexplicably smiling. Dario let the silence sit for a moment, not because he needed to collect himself. Not because he was searching for words. He let it sit the way a person sets something heavy on a table, deliberately, with full awareness of the sound it makes when it lands, because he understood that the council needed a moment to finish being afraid before they would be capable of actually listening. He was considerate that way. 3 months ago, Dario began, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed nothing because they have not needed to. Ambassador Kezel stood in this chamber and called humanity the galaxy's most forgettable species. He paused. I want to start by saying thank you for that. Nobody laughed. I mean that genuinely. We had been asking this council for expanded recognition for 11 years. 11 years of applications, proposals, formal requests through proper channels, all the correct paperwork filed in all the correct order. 11 years of being told, politely and then less politely, that humanity was not quite significant enough to warrant serious consideration. He tilted his head slightly. We were finding it very difficult to explain to our people back home why we should keep trying. He glanced back at the viewport for just a moment. A brief, almost casual glance, the kind you give a thing you built and are reasonably fond of. Ambassador Kezel solved that problem for us in about 4 minutes. So. Genuinely. Thank you. Kezel said nothing. Kezel had, in point of fact, not said anything since the viewport had filled with ships. It was sitting in its chair with the specific stillness of a creature that has recently and dramatically revised its understanding of a situation and has not yet finished processing the revision. Now, Dario continued, I want to be very clear about what this is and what this is not. This is not a threat. Threats are made by parties who are uncertain of their position and are attempting to manufacture leverage. We are not uncertain of our position. Another brief glance back. As you can see. A Brellan delegate made a very small sound and then stopped making it. This is also not a declaration of hostility. We have no interest in war. War is expensive and time-consuming, and frankly we have a great deal of infrastructure left to build. He said this the way someone mentions a packed schedule. Conversationally. As if 4,000 ships behind him were simply an item on a to-do list that had been completed ahead of schedule. What this is, Dario said, is an explanation. He straightened slightly, not dramatically, just the natural adjustment of someone settling into the part of the conversation they have been waiting to get to. Every species in this chamber evolved somewhere. Most of you evolved somewhere comfortable. We did not. We evolved on a world that treated survival as a negotiation and rarely offered favorable terms. We have been hit by every variety of catastrophe this universe produces. We have lost, repeatedly, on scales that would have permanently ended most civilizations represented in this room. He let that land. We are still here. We have always been still here. That is not an accident and it is not luck. It is a characteristic. The chamber was so quiet that the ambient hum of the crystalline walls was audible for the first time in the memory of anyone present. Now. There is a word in the human language for the specific state that results when something built the way we are built gets publicly dismissed, underestimated, and laughed at by people who did not do their research. He paused. He looked directly at the council. He looked, briefly and specifically, at Kezel. The word is annoyed. He said it simply. No performance. No raised voice. No accompanying dramatic gesture toward the fleet behind him, just the word, annoyed, and somehow, in the delivery of it, with everything the council now knew sitting in the room with them, with 4,000 ships visible through the viewport and a physicist somewhere in the gallery who still had not reopened her data pad, it was the most frightening word anyone in that chamber had ever heard spoken aloud. Rage. They understood. Rage had rules. Rage peaked and burned and exhausted itself. Every civilization had models for rage. Entire branches of galactic diplomacy existed specifically to manage rage. Nobody had a model for a species that built 4,000 ships because it was annoyed. Annoyed implied that this was not even the serious response. Annoyed implied there were levels above this that the council had not yet seen and that Dario was, in some patient and unhurried way, hoping very much would not become necessary. Several delegates looked at each other, several more looked back at the viewport, nobody looked at Kezel. Dario clasped his hands in front of him with the air of a man who has said what he came to say and is now simply being polite about the wrap-up. We would like, he said pleasantly, to discuss our seat on the Security Directorate. Here is Part 6 fully written out. The formal apology from Ambassador Kezel was submitted in writing. This was noted by everyone. In Vreth diplomatic tradition, written apologies were reserved for offenses of the highest order. Spoken apologies were for minor infractions. Written apologies were for situations where the offending party had looked carefully at all available information and concluded that being extremely, documentably sorry was the only remaining viable strategy. Kezel's apology was 4 pages long. It used the word regrettable 11 times. It was, by the assessment of every diplomatic analyst who later studied it, the most thorough apology in Vreth recorded history, which is a distinction that Kezel had almost certainly not been hoping to earn. During its tenure, the Galactic Council voted on Earth's membership tier 3 days after Dario's transmission. The vote was not close. 17 civilizations, the same 17 that had laughed 3 months ago, approved Earth's elevation to full primary membership with Security Directorate inclusion in a session that lasted less than an hour. This was, for a council that had spent 4 years debating the standardization of interstellar shipping container dimensions, essentially instantaneous. Nobody made speeches about it, nobody asked for amendments. The vote happened with the focused efficiency of people who have recently updated their understanding of the universe and are now very motivated to be on the correct side of things. Dario Vasquez accepted the membership with a short, gracious statement that contained no sarcasm whatsoever, which the council found almost more unsettling than if it had. Then the other requests started arriving. The Fenari Collective sent a formal peace treaty proposal to Earth within the week. This was surprising because the Fenari Collective had never been in conflict with humanity. They had barely interacted with humanity. The treaty was nonetheless 12 pages long, professionally drafted, and covered 17 categories of potential future dispute with proposed resolutions for each one. Earth's Foreign Office sent back a polite acknowledgement and privately wondered what exactly the Fenari thought was going to happen. The Duscan Republic followed 6 days later with their own treaty proposal. The Duscan Republic had also never wronged humanity in any meaningful way. Their proposal was 9 pages long and included, in the appendix, a list of historical moments where the Duscan Republic had considered saying something dismissive about humans and had decided against it, apparently submitted as evidence of good character. Earth's Foreign Office read the appendix twice, then the Chorvali Dominion sent one. The Chorvali had never met a human in person. Their treaty was 20 pages. It included a gift, the gift was a very expensive mineral sample from their homeworld. Chosen, according to the accompanying note, because they had heard humans appreciated geology. This was not entirely accurate as a characterization of humanity, but it was thoughtful, and Earth's Foreign Office sent a warm reply, and the Trevally spent the next several months telling everyone they had excellent relations with the humans, which was technically true. Kessel retired from diplomatic service at the end of that cycle. The retirement was described officially as voluntary. Posick, the junior intelligence officer who had filed the original scout request and had been right about everything, was promoted twice in 4 months and given an office with a window, which in Vreth government buildings was a meaningful distinction, and so the galaxy, that vast and ancient collection of civilizations, each one convinced of its own significance, each one carrying centuries of accumulated wisdom and hard-learned lessons about how the universe operated, settled into a new and slightly more careful relationship with the small blue planet at the edge of an unremarkable solar system. They updated their databases. They revised their assessments. They moved humanity from 43rd most significant species to a ranking that several council members privately felt should have a different category entirely, something that communicated not just significance but a specific quality of significance that the existing scale had not been designed to measure. They did not laugh at the humans again. This was wise, because here is the oldest lesson in the universe, the one that predates spaceflight and diplomacy and crystalline council chambers and color-shifting lights designed for 17 different species. The lesson that the Earth itself had been teaching everything that lived on it for 200,000 years, in the language of earthquakes and winters and creatures with too many teeth and Mondays that simply refuse to end.do not dismiss the thing that has already survived everything.do not laugh at the species that counts catastrophe as a reference point, and whatever you do, do not walk into a room full of witnesses and call them forgettable, because forgettable things do not smile like that, and they absolutely do not build 4,000 ships in 90 days because they were merely annoyed. The galaxy went quiet. It stayed that way. It had finally learned to pay attention.